So what is the science of reading? The science of reading is the converging evidence of what matters and what works in literacy instruction, organized around models that describe how and why. So let's start with that last part, that model. What matters for learning to read and why? I really like simple, and so did the authors of this model, the simple view of reading. Their model is used by reading researchers all over the place. First, it sort of asserts something I think we can all agree with, and that is that the overall goal for kids in reading is to read with comprehension. To get there, it's really two things that early literacy needs to focus on as goals. One is to teach kids to break the code to be able to sound out words. That's decoding. You'll also sometimes see word recognition as that summary title of this piece in red. If I can turn printed words into spoken ones, I'm decoding them. The other component here is the ability to understand those words and sentences. If I can make meaning from a text, even if someone else is reading it aloud to me, then I'm showing my language comprehension. So sometimes one is strong and one is weak. If you gave me a text in Spanish, I could probably decode the words, say them correctly, but my listening comprehension is really weak. So I will not be able to read with comprehension in complex Spanish text. Now think of kind of the opposite tilt. Read aloud time. There's a rich, interesting book that we're reading to a 4- or 5-year-old, and the student's hearing that language and understanding a lot of it. But most kids that age can't decode that book on their own, so their independent reading comprehension is still being held back by that, right? So it's two factors then, and you can't make up for one by being good at the other. So we actually have to make sure we teach all kids both. And if you're only assessing one but not the other, you might have a blind spot. We designed MAP Reading Fluency to follow this simple view to assess both. So simple was just the broad strokes, right? This graphic shows kind of an extension of that view. You can still see there in red decoding or word recognition, right? And that language comprehension in blue. So there's more complexity to what matters, and it's at this closer view that we start to find how research aligns in areas on what works. So you can find a research base converging around phonemic awareness, for example, and a research base around background knowledge. What works to support each of these elements, right? So that's a lot. Probably a lot to ask a teacher or even a building administrator to keep up on, sort of study by study. There are probably 1,000 studies published across these various topics every year or two. So, distillation, right? Given my training and my advanced age, I don't put a lot of stock into the findings of one study that's not yet replicated. But I do put a lot of stock into systematic reviews of converging evidence. That constitutes the science. Our own tax dollars at work did a lot of great distilling. So the IES What Works Clearinghouse has these that are pictured on this screen. These are research to practice guides. You can find a link to these in this webinar console in the materials associated with this webinar. So these research to practice guides, a great idea here is to form a learning community around these, right? Read this research evidence and how to implement it. Try things. Reflect on those implementations together, right? And that together part is just huge right now. We need each other to grow together, give each other boosts and encouragement. So there are other trusted distillations, National Research Council publications, National Reading Panel. Some of those are not very frequent. So for those of you staying right on the cutting edge, peer-reviewed articles that synthesize, meta-analysis, and so on. There's a lot that we know about good instruction that has been stable over the past decade or more, but there are areas of active research where we want to keep evolving our understanding of what the converging evidence tells us. Okay, so in decoding and word recognition, what does it look like or sound like when there's support that's following this science of reading? The emphasis is on sounds within words. You'll see an actual scope and sequence of taught phonics. and application to connected text that has those phonics patterns, right? You've heard of systematic and explicit instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics, major tenet of the science of reading. This is the kind of stuff you should see and hear. Leaders, especially, your teachers need great resources to pull this off. Don't set them up for frustration by not providing a good phonics curriculum, for example. Okay, language comprehension, including from oral language and from written language, is critical right from the start, before kids can read on their own fluently. What does it look like or sound like when we're supporting comprehension following the science of reading? Really high engagement with rich written texts for all students. If students can't read sentences yet, then this is going to look like interactive read aloud. When students can read, the students that are more challenged by this complex of a text, they're receiving scaffolding like vocabulary previews and supported repeated readings. Students are not sitting quietly at attention for almost the whole literacy block. They are actively developing their language skills much of the time too. And they're learning content, knowledge and vocabulary. That's what they're going to need for making sense of the reading material that they will encounter and learn from as they grow older. Okay, so using evidence-based practices from, say, the What Works Clearinghouse or other sources, great. Now what? The particulars of who your students are, how your teachers implement and surround this implementation with engagement and motivation. These differ. These really matter, right? So we need data to let us know, how well is this working? If it's not working, that has to drive a decision to change what we're doing. We need to be reflecting and adjusting and finding ways to increase intensity and engagement. What really matters is whether these particular kids are learning to read well, not just whether the practice checks a box as aligned to the science of reading. It's an ongoing process. Okay? Checking with growth measures is important. And for kids that are getting extra intensity or intervention, using those higher frequency growth checks is critical. That's progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is a tool for answering, is this working well enough? In math reading fluency, we have progress monitoring tools in oral reading fluency, phonics and word recognition, and phonological awareness. It's really important in progress monitoring to set ambitious goals because we want to close gaps, not keep kids on the same trajectory where gaps are not closed. We want to be using our data to evaluate, is the growth I'm seeing towards my goal, is it steep enough, right? The science of reading is clear that progress in each of these content areas especially matters for future reading comprehension success. Remember that benchmark assessments thrice yearly are another way to monitor growth. If you have MAP growth in addition to your MAP reading fluency, using multiple measures would mean something like this graphic is communicating. For those of you that use MAP growth in addition, you'll want to watch that RIT score going up across seasons. That can kind of corroborate the seasonal and progress monitoring growth that you're seeing on oral reading fluency and foundational skills using MAP reading fluency or other tools. So part of building a culture of evidence-based practice is building a culture that really engages with data as evidence.